The most twisted creation of the Dark Lord was not a dragon or a demon, but a living mockery of the children of God. This is the story of a blasphemy so profound it poisons the very soul of Arda, a sin of corruption that echoes through every age of the world. His ambition was not merely to conquer, but to unmake the very fabric of creation, a goal that makes the quest for the One Ring seem a minor squabble. Before Sauron learned to forge rings of power, his master, Morgoth, perfected the art of forging living things into instruments of hate. He did not create them from nothing. He stole them from the light. In the ageless quiet of the world, under the twilight of the stars, a new consciousness stirred. By the still, silent shores of the lake Cuivién, the firstborn awoke. They were the Quendis, those that speak with voices, known to history as the Elves. Their first sight was not the sun or the moon, for neither had yet been made. They saw only the cold, brilliant light of the stars of Varda. There was no evil in their hearts, no concept of shadow or decay. They were as new as the world itself, their forms filled with the light they so admired, their spirits unburdened by time or grief. They were the most beautiful and beloved of all the creations of Ilúvatar, the children of the stars, and they were utterly alone. They wandered in this pristine twilight, naming the things they saw, creating poetry and music in a world that had known only the thunder of the gods and the silence of rock and tree. They believed they were the only living things with reason in all of Arda. They were wrong. A shadow had long fallen upon the northern reaches of the world. An ear was listening, an eye was watching. For Melkor, the great enemy, now named Morgoth, had established his domain in the fortress of Utumno, a hellish pit of cold and fire dug deep into the earth. From there his malice seeped into the very soil and stone of the world. His spies, formless things of shadow and beasts of twisted shape, roamed the lands, and they brought him news of a new race, fair and graceful, awakening in the east. Morgoth was filled with a hatred and a jealousy so profound it shook the foundations of his fortress. He, the mightiest of all the Ainur, had poured his essence into the world, claiming it as his own. Yet Ilúvatar, the one god, had placed these creatures upon it, these usurpers. He could not create life himself. This was the one power Ilúvatar held alone. He could only mar, to twist, to ruin what others had made. And in these first, innocent children, he saw his ultimate canvas. But how could the Valar, the guardians of the world, have allowed this? How could they, resting in the blessed light of their two trees in the far west, have been so blind to the first great tragedy to befall the children of the world? The truth is a bitter one. They did not know. The light of their trees did not reach the far corners of the world, and in the twilight of Middle-earth, Morgoth's power was a veil. The Valar believed their enemy was contained after an earlier war. They busied themselves with the ordering of their own land, leaving the rest of Arda to the starlight. A fatal error. The elves began to know fear. When one would wander alone, or even in a small group, they would vanish. A shadow would fall, a hunting horn would sound unnaturally in the distance, or a great, dark horseman would be seen. The elves named him the Rider. No one who was taken ever returned. Panic and mistrust spread amongst the Quendi. Some began to argue that the Rider was one of the very gods they had been warned of, a wrathful hunter come to punish them. The seeds of discord were sown by Morgoth's lies, whispered on the wind, and in nightmares. He turned their fear into a weapon against them, making them fear the very Valar who would have been their saviors. The Taken were not killed. Their fate was to be something far worse than death. They were dragged across the continent, over the grinding ice and bitter mountains of the Iron Mountains, a range Morgoth himself had raised to defend his realm. They were brought to the gates of Utumno. Utumno was not a fortress of towers and walls like Barad-dûr or Angband. It was a subterranean cancer, a labyrinth of pits, dungeons, forges, and halls of torment that burrowed deep into the bones of the world, far from the light of the stars or the sight of the Valar. Here, the very air was poison, and the silence was broken only by the ring of hammers and the echoes of endless weeping. Into these depths, the first children of Ilúvatar were cast. Morgoth's purpose was not simple slavery. He sought a more complete and horrifying victory. He wanted to prove to his creator, and to himself, that anything made could be unmade. He would take Ilúvatar's most beloved creation and turn it into the thing most antithetical to its own nature. He would make them hate the light that they were born from. The process was slow. It had to be. A mortal creature could be broken in days, but elves were immortal. Their spirits were bound to the world until its end, and their resilience was immense. To corrupt them, Morgoth had to wage a war not just on their bodies, but on their very fee, their soul. He began with lies. He whispered to them in the darkness for ages, telling them that they were abandoned, that the Valar were cruel tyrants who hoarded the light of the world for themselves, leaving them to languish in the dark. He showed them visions, twisted and false, of their brethren living in blissful ignorance, having forgotten them. It was not a simple act of breeding or sorcery. What Morgoth planned required something far more terrible: the complete unmaking of a soul. But how can one defile what is immortal? When lies were not enough, he used pain. Unspeakable torments were devised in the pits of Utumno, arts of cruelty refined over millennia of practice on his own Maiar servants. Their bodies were stretched and broken, remade and reshaped in agonizing cycles. Their immortality became their curse, for they could not find the release of death. They could only endure, and endure, and endure, until endurance became their only reality. But the final and most potent weapon was the corruption of the spirit. He forced them to commit acts against one another, breaking the bonds of kinship that were the core of their being. He starved them of all light, all beauty, all music, until the memory of the stars was a faint, painful ghost. He fed them on hate and fear, making it their only sustenance. He took everything that made them elves and filled the void with a reflection of his own dark will. Their spirits, the immortal Fee, began to shrink, to wither. Trapped in a prison of mutilated flesh and a mind filled with lies, the light within them guttered and died. They forgot the sound of their own names. They forgot the sight of the stars. All that was left was the master, the darkness, and the pain. The screams from the deeps of Utumno began to change. They were no longer the cries of elves. They were becoming something else. But what new horror was being forged in that darkness? A living weapon born from broken light. The answer would be Morgoth's greatest jest, a permanent, living wound in the side of his creator. He was creating a new people, a race bred from slaves, born in misery, and designed for one purpose: to hate the world and all the beauty within it, to be the eternal enemies of their own kin. Their forms began to twist. Their straight limbs bent and buckled into crooked, powerful shapes. Their skin, once fair, became thick and coarse, colored like stone or scorched earth, in shades of sallow green, gray, and black. Their faces, once filled with a celestial grace, were contorted into masks of pure malice. Their eyes, which had first opened to behold the wonder of the stars, now held only a dull, hateful red glow, like the embers of a dying fire, or a baleful reflection of the forges that had become their only sun. The first orcs were born. They were a mockery of the children of Iluvatar. Where elves were graceful, orcs were crooked. Where elves sang, orcs screeched and gibbered in a debased tongue of their own. Where elves created beauty, orcs knew only how to defile and destroy. Morgoth unleashed them within the caverns of Utumno, testing them, honing their cruelty. He had his army, a legion of slaves who would breed in the darkness and multiply, whose only joy was in slaughter, and whose only purpose was to serve his hatred of the light. A resounding success, a final, ultimate blasphemy against creation itself. But was it? Was the victory as complete as he believed? This is where the story takes a darker, more complex turn. For in his ultimate act of malice, Morgoth may have committed his first great failure. He had succeeded in breaking their bodies and minds. But what of the Fee? What of the immortal elven soul? The spirit of an elf is bound to Arda until the very end. It cannot be unmade. It cannot be truly destroyed by any power within the world, not even by a Vala like Morgoth. It can be wounded, scarred, and imprisoned, but not annihilated. And this single, immutable fact of creation became the fatal flaw in his design. He had not created a new race. He had created a prison. Every orc that shambled from the pits of Utumno carried within its twisted form the screaming, captive soul of an elf, a spirit that remembered, on some deep, subconscious level, the starlight it was born to. This is the secret, central tragedy of the orcs. Their rage was not born of simple malice. It was born of an unbearable, eternal agony. Why do they hate beauty? Why do they despise the sun and the moon? Why do they loathe the elves with a passion that transcends mere orders? Because every beautiful thing, every ray of light, every note of an elven song is an agonizing reminder of what they were, what they have lost. It is a salt rubbed into a wound that can never, ever heal. They destroy beauty because its very existence is a torment to the withered Fee trapped inside them. They hate elves because in their fair faces they see the ghost of their own. This internal, spiritual schism is also the source of their weakness. It is why orcs are a self-destructive, chaotic force. They hate their master, Morgoth, even as they serve him. They hate each other, fighting and killing for scraps of meat or a perceived slight. Their society, if it can be called that, is built on nothing but fear and dominance. They can be driven into a terrifying wave of destruction, but they have no true loyalty, no unity. They are a race fundamentally at war with itself, because every individual orc is a soul at war with its own body. Morgoth had intended to create a perfectly obedient slave, a living weapon. Instead, he had created a being of pure self-loathing. He had not extinguished the light of the elves. He had trapped it, causing it to curdle into a shadow of perpetual misery. He had bred a race whose defining characteristic was pain, and while he could use that pain, direct it as a weapon, he could never truly control it. It was a poison that would forever taint his own armies, making them unreliable, fractious, and prone to routing in terror when their master's will was not directly upon them. So while the elves slept in ignorance by the waters of Quivien, a shadow was stirring in the north. An army of their mutilated brethren, their first children, was being drilled in the arts of murder. But this was not the only evil Morgoth was breeding in the dark. The orcs were to be his foot soldiers, his endless tide of infantry. But for his captains, for his elite guard, he required something more, something with a will of fire and a shadow of its own. His gaze turned back to the Maiar, the lesser spirits who had followed him into the void in the beginning. Many had already taken monstrous forms, becoming the Valaraukar, the demons of terror. But some he sought to corrupt in a different way. He took spirits of fire and shadow and bound them into physical shapes of immense power, creating his most dreaded servants, the Balrogs. Unlike the orcs, who were a corruption of flesh, the Balrogs were a corruption of spirit made manifest. They were beings of the same order as Gandalf or Sauron, but twisted to the service of pure destruction. Their hearts were of fire, and their weapons were of flame and shadow. They were not mere beasts. They possessed cunning, immense power, and a malice that was ancient and pure. They would be the scourges of his armies, the commanders who would drive the orcs forward and face the mightiest of his enemies. And still, Morgoth was not satisfied. His mind, vast and inventive, saw the world not as a place of beauty, but as a collection of raw materials to be reshaped to his will. He looked at the beasts of the earth and saw potential for greater monstrosities. He delved into the earth itself, twisting the very stone and fire to his purpose. From this dark genesis came the werewolves, evil spirits locked in the bodies of immense wolves, led by their terrible sire, Karkaroth. And from the pits came the dragons, Morgoth's ultimate expression of brute force and fire, though in these early days they were not yet the winged, cunning calamities they would later become. The first of them, Glaurung, the father of dragons, was a great worm of immense power, a living battering ram of fire and malice. Thus, the arsenals of Utumno were filled. Orcs for the legions, trolls for the heavy assault, Balrogs for the captains, and the great beasts, wolves and dragons, as weapons of terror and shock. An entire ecosystem of evil, a shadow kingdom built on pain and fear, was now ready. All of it festering deep beneath the earth, waiting for the moment to be unleashed upon a world that did not even know it existed. The Valar, in their bliss in Valinor, had yet to discover this cancer growing in the heart of Middle-earth. And the Elves, the source of Morgoth's greatest living insult, still awoke each night to the innocent stars, unaware that their broken kin were multiplying in the darkness, being taught to hate the very light they cherished. The great lie of Morgoth was complete. He had created a world within a world, a reflection of his own soul, and it was almost ready to be born. And so, two worlds existed under the same sky of stars, utterly ignorant of one another. One was a world of pristine light, of order and of peace, guarded by the godlike Valar who believed the great evils of the past were chained and forgotten. They had built their perfect kingdom, a paradise walled off from the sorrows of the wider world, and they thought this enough. The other was a world of newborn wonder, where the first children of Iluvatar awoke to a life of poetry and starlight. They knew nothing of war, nothing of malice, nothing of the shadow that had already fallen upon their kin. Their first songs echoed over the waters, a music of pure innocence, destined to be tragically brief. But evil was not chained, and it was not forgotten. It had taken root in the heart of the world, growing strong in the darkness, nurtured by a will of absolute hatred. Utumno was not merely a fortress. It was a living cancer upon Arda, a monument to a perfected malice, and its gates were about to open. The stage was set for the first great tragedy of the world. The pieces were all in place. The light, in its beautiful, arrogant blindness. The children, in their fragile, starlit innocence. And the shadow, patient, vast and hungry, having spent ages sharpening its teeth for the feast to come. The long peace of Arda was a lie. The sleep of Yavanna, the songs of the Elves, the light of the trees in Valinor, was all just the deep, quiet breath the world was taking before the first scream. A storm was gathering that would break the mountains, spill the seas, and stain the very stars with blood. An age was about to die before it had ever truly learned to live. The age of innocence is over. The war for Middle-earth is about to begin. To witness the breaking of the world and the forging of the great legends of the First Age, subscribe to the _Silmarillion_Chronicles, and do not miss what